But building upon that last session, we're now going to hone in on the innovation environment. And this session will be moderated by Ms. Jackie Eaton. Ms. Eaton is the principal analyst at the NATO Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center in Portugal. She is responsible for the provision of analytic advice to the military on the adaptation and transformation of the alliance, based on lessons learned from NATO entities, nations, and other organizations. Ms. Eaton has worked for NATO for 16 years, including 2 years as the scientific advisor to the NATO chief scientist at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. Prior to joining NATO, Ms. Eaton was a defense analyst at the UK Defense Science and Technology Organization. Ms. Eaton's research interests are focused on social psychology, cognition, organizational learning, and the decision sciences. Welcome, Ms. Eaton.
Thank you, and it is my great pleasure to invite my two panelists for this session up to the stage now. I have David Van Weel and François Chopard. Please join me here. So, good afternoon and welcome everyone to the fifth session of the day. This is the panel on innovation environment. And as I said, it's my pleasure here to have with me two panelists today, David Van Weel and François Chopard. I will just take a second to introduce my panelists, and then we'll launch straight into their opportunity to talk to you about their background and their programs. And then we will open for questions in the same format that we did on the previous one. So first with David. He's NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. He is the NATO Secretary General's primary advisor on emerging security challenges and their implications for the security of the alliance, and a member of the Secretary General's senior management team. Prior to joining NATO, he was Foreign Policy and Defence Advisor for the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and he began his career in the Dutch Navy. François is the founder and CEO of Starburst Aerospace Accelerator. He founded Starburst in 2012 as the first incubator and accelerator dedicated to aerospace startups. Starburst is one of the most prolific in number of startups it invests in. And François has over 20 years of experience in strategy consulting, entrepreneurship, and business development. Thank you both for joining us here today. As I said, each of our panelists will now open with a few minutes of presenting themselves, their backgrounds, and their portfolio, and some ideas to kind of start us off with the panel discussion, and then we'll launch into the question time. And so if I could pass the floor to you, please, David. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. So thank you for the invitation, John Mickle, and it's really a pleasure to be here at such an important stakeholder within the NATO enterprise when it comes down to all the innovation initiatives that we have going on in NATO right now. So as mentioned, I'm the Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. I really hate that title. It sounds like I'm dealing with stuff that's not here yet or not relevant yet, and that as soon as it becomes relevant, it goes over to somebody else. So kind of a think tank idea. That's definitely not the way I view the portfolio that I'm responsible for in NATO. It encompasses counterterrorism, cyber, climate change, energy security, innovation, and the Science for Peace and Security program, amongst other topics. And you would agree with me, especially in this crowd, that all of these topics are very much emerged here with us today, and even in the conflict in Ukraine now, which to some extent is a classic conventional conflict, we see that all these elements, from cyber to disinformation to the use of innovation or the misuse of innovation, are playing a large role. So basically the goal that I set myself in coming into this job was, how can we make these non-hardcore military topics more mainstream into the alliance, because they are the mainstream of the security that all our citizens experience. whether it's cyber, whether it's climate change, energy security, now recently a very relevant topic again. These are all the security challenges that our populations face. And as a security alliance, NATO needs to find an answer to that. Now today I'll focus just very shortly on what that means in the field of innovation and what we're trying to do there. And the name of Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund has already fallen here, and of course I applaud that because I just realized that exactly 1 year ago we had the NATO Summit where the leaders agreed on establishing the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic and the NATO Innovation Fund. Without being melancholic, looking back at the last 365 days, I think we've made a lot of concrete steps towards realizing those what were then just great abstract ideas. The idea behind Diana is that in order to maintain our technological edge, we can no longer rely on the luxury that we had in the 1970s and 80s, where we had large government-run R&D programs which produced for the military the cutting-edge new technologies, which then maybe got a commercial spin-off. And as a naval officer by background, I remember the days of the GPS P code and Y codes when we had more accurate GPS signals in the military than was available due to selective availability to the public. And a lot of great inventions started out in that way. It gave the government total control of new technologies. It gave the government a leading edge when it came down to understanding these technologies, implementing them, but also regulating them, which of course is very important also nowadays when we look at new technologies like AI. That luxury is gone, and it's starting to show. It's starting to show in the field. In a day and age where a large logistic company is able to deliver stuff to me wherever I am with drones, and let me pay for that delivery by collecting whatever it was that I ordered. The military largely still runs their logistics in a battlefield with 10-ton diesel-electric trucks based on Excel spreadsheets. And we're seeing the vulnerability of that kind of running behind in implementing technology. We're seeing it now, fortunately, on the Russian side, with the vulnerability of their fuel convoys, with the large mistakes they made in their logistical chain. But it's not just autonomy and logistics, it's across the board. It's partly because we disinvested in R&D, and I remember that being a young civil servant in the MOD, that when we had to downsize the peace dividend after the Cold War, the first thing we cut down on were the R&D budgets. Why? Because we wanted to keep our acquisition programs going, we wanted to keep our personnel in, we wanted to keep our legacy systems as much as we could. It hurt us in the long run. We all realized that, but it really did. Another reason that we're finding that we're losing this connection is because a lot of the innovation now is coming out of the private sector, and it's coming out of the private sector because it's commercially driven, but also because it's coming not out of large established corporations per se. No, it's happening in that startup community. The new EDTs that we're seeing, they mostly rise around academia in the startup communities before they grow big and become disruptive. And just to give you an example, nowadays most of you will use, when you pay with your mobile phone, the software of Adyen, which was a Dutch startup only 10 years ago. I know one of the founders of Adyen, and they were desperate because they knew they had a great technology in providing electronic banking, but there was not an established bank in the world that was willing to take their product on board. They didn't see the opportunity. They didn't see the disruptive nature of what that technology could bring. So there's a lot of misunderstanding between the worlds of government and large established corporation and innovators. A second reason. The third reason, and it was already mentioned, is the name that the defense industry has with this innovation community. And I sometimes equal it to the tobacco industry. Working for NATO is almost as bad as working for Philip Morris. That's a problem. I've sat on panels where a Ivy League professor could say in 2 sentences, it's a good thing they have the social credit system in China because they had a big problem with jaywalking in Beijing. And then after that hilarious sentence, he managed to say, and I'm really worried that NATO is going to venture into AI. So in those communities where our students are being educated, they're being told that working for Huawei on facial recognition software is not that bad, but working for NATO is. That's strange. And then lastly, what is a reason for this gap? It's the unknown of what the defense world actually needs. And there I can give a very concrete example of a startup working on GPS independent precision navigation based on the Earth's magnetic field, now having it down to around a square meter precision, which is great. The reason he came up with that technology is that he read that a large supermarket had a problem in their warehouses in having their autonomous vehicles run because of a lack of GPS reception under the tin roof. At the same time, all of you here know that he solved one of the biggest military challenges. How can we operate in a GPS-denied environment? He never knew that that was military relevant. On the other side, we often don't know in our world what is out there in new technologies. So we have to bridge that gap. And Diana, and I'll be very short about that because most of you will have heard about it, is designed just to do that. To make use of the best innovation ecosystems in the world that are still in allied countries, but then make use of it for dual-use technologies so that we can become early adapters again, so that we can early identify new technologies to actual military problems. And that requires an agile way of operating. We cannot work on a basis of requirements because we probably don't know what we require yet. But we do have problems that we want solved. And we need to be agnostic as to what the solutions to those problems might be. And then we need to be able to actually help these potential solutions and mature them. And that means providing grants to startups within days. Making sure that they have access to a rapid adoption service so that allies can actually purchase new technologies coming out of Diana in a reasonable time frame. And to have a NATO innovation fund to actually put our money where our mouth is and show that we're willing to put risk capital into these new companies that are trying to create dual-use solutions. With an average NATO procurement cycle of 16.1 years, I think we have some work to do in bridging that gap. That is why Diana is not replacing all we're doing at NATO. It's an addition specifically tailored to this new community to provide us with this insight into new technologies.
Thank you, David. There's exciting times for innovation at NATO right now. It's really good to hear. And thank you, François, if you could present your piece.
Yeah, so I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitations and the events. I think it's a great time to talk about these subjects. When I created Starburst about 10 years ago, everybody thought I was crazy, thinking that startups in aviation, space, and defense could one day make a difference. And here we are, 10 years later. That's now a big topic. How can we leverage these new entities, these new technologies, these disruptions to make a difference and keep an advantage to maintain peace? And so 10 years ago, of course, that was a crazy idea. Only SpaceX and a few others were, running the show. Today, our organization, Starburst, has grown to, 10 countries, only allied countries, of course, about 80 people. We scout more than 3,000 new startups in our area every year. So again, aviation, space, and defense. 3,000. And it has not slowed down. I don't think the market or the lack of capital will slow down that trend. because it's essential, because all these entrepreneurs are working on a mission which is bringing technology superiority to the allied country in order to maintain peace. The war in Ukraine is a very good example that we don't want that. We want, and I mean, the technology superiority is the new nuclear bomb. The country will won the war or will prevent the war will be the one with the fastest robots. But nobody wants to engage with that. And so we've been working on that field. We started in Paris. We moved to LA. We are in Montreal. We are in Munich, in Madrid, in Tel Aviv. We are in Singapore, Seoul, and we are in a huge expansion phase. In these 10 years, we built accelerators globally. We built incubators locally, and we've been able to engage with most of the governments in the country we are working on. So Emmanuel was there, the Innovation Defense Lab. We are in our building hosting a part of their team to do open innovation. We are feeding them with hundreds of startups every year. We do the same thing with the Space Force. We run 2 incubators for NASA. We run the internal incubator for IAI in Tel Aviv, and we work with MAFAT. We have developed that capabilities to work with government organizations and military organizations. And so that's the key enabler. When you look at startups in, again, aviation, space, and defense, you talk about, ground vehicle, ships, and all that thing. So we look at everything. There is now 37 or 38 unicorns. So 38 startups that are now valued at above 1 billion. Their total valuation is $230 billion, which means that during the pandemic, Airbus and Boeing lost approximately that valuation. And so the gap has been filled by startups. And that's really something to keep in mind. In the past, we would talk about the death valley for these startups, very long life cycle. Today, for the best one, between the time that they get created and the time they will reach the 1 billion valuations, some of them, needs only 5 years. Doesn't mean that the product is fully ready, but they reach a size where they're able to raise hundreds of millions, invest these amounts in R&D, technology and products to make a difference. And when you look at these type of categories, when you look at, they've been working a lot on rockets, satellites. When a startup raises, $500 million to develop the next supersonic aircraft, there's no corporations that is today investing that amount of money on disruptive sectors. When you look at Airbus and Boeing, yes, they can put $10 billion on the table to develop the next A320, the next Boeing 737. But they will not put $500 million to develop the next eVTOL and right now nobody is really working on supersonic aircraft. Maybe Lockheed is funded by only Pentagon money. These startups are funded a little bit by government, but also by private money. In Silicon Valley a couple of years ago, they realized that the Pentagon was not aggressive enough in looking for technology. So there's a bunch of venture capital firms that are now took the intent to invest in pure defense tech startups. And that's what we are doing with Starburst. We set up a fund between San Francisco and LA, and that's what we mostly do: defense tech, space tech, and our first investment have been very focused on these topics. We have announced a 300 million fund in Europe to do the same. We are launching a fund in Israel, same thing, to do seed funding, and one in Singapore to do more around aviation and green impact. But we want, as individual, we are not military, we are purely private, but we want also to make a difference. We want to contribute and support these efforts and these initiatives. And we think that Diana is a great initiative. We've been part to a lot of these groups and thinking and process to come to Diana, and we really think it's important that it's taking place at the highest level at the NATO organization. So startups are playing a key role today, but more importantly tomorrow. On legacy area, so we are seeing a lot of satellites being built by startups, but also on the software, on the more intangible, on the more complex area that the legacy players had difficulties to grasp with, whether it's cyber, whether it's purely AI, whether it's quantum. There's a new range of entrepreneurs and startups who also want to make a difference. And so that's where we stand now.
Thank you. That was very interesting, and it's good to know that there's other money on the table and not just that coming from governments that we have available here. As Dale did, I'd like to open with my own question while you have time to think of yours. And I won't send you to coffee earlier, so please do think of questions to fill up the time and make the best use of our panelists here and everything they can bring to us. So my question actually comes from that iconic photo that the STO uses all the time of von Karman and the military officer. And so I feel like there's a kind of theme going on here. It was brought out in what David said about us not knowing what each other's problem is or what solutions are. And as well that you were talking about that there are so many startups out there that are creating value, and that, how do we get that into the defense realm? So my question is, like, how is Starburst working to bring the military and the civilian worlds together to actually deliver solutions?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think it's crucial to bring those two worlds together. I think one of the reasons that the Israeli defense startup community is successful is because everybody in Israel goes through military service, therefore knows what the military requirements are, what is needed in the field. And then, of course, it helps that security is seen as existential, so the investments are also being made. And there's a number of other reasons, but one is you have to know what the end user needs. And I think Diana will do that by making use of those end users. And unfortunately, in NATO, we have no shortage of military that will be incorporated into Diana in every step of the way. So the military will be part in setting the problem sets that Diana will work on. They will have a big role in that, but not only them. The STO will have a big role in that. The CNET community will have a big role in that. We'll be looking into industry to have a role in problem setting so that we get the best input out to these innovation ecosystems. Then the second part is, how do you reach those innovators that are maybe not that willing to work with us? Well, the solution in our mind is not to bring them into barracks somewhere outside the city in the countryside where they have to show 3 passports before they can get into the first circle. So we need to be where they are, and we need to be there with an open door, accessible and open. And I think the footprint of Diana is based on that. So the headquarters in Europe is going to be in London, and not just in London, it's going to be co-located within the AI faculty of Imperial College at their new campus in White City, because that's where the innovation is happening. And all the accelerator sites that we've selected have been selected on the basis of their access to innovators, not in the defense sector, no, the broader ecosystems at large, just as Starburst is tapping into those as well. And then as you go along, we will make sure that scientists, end users, and business coaches will be alongside these innovators every step of the way as they go through the program. Because you might end up halfway with a fantastic new robot, and Emmanuel Kiva mentioned an example that dogs become upset by this specific technology. We will see the same of things coming out of Diana. It's a great camera, it's a great autonomous vehicle, however, it makes too much noise to be used in a covert operation. or you drop it and it breaks. Or we used it in -40 in Norway and all of a sudden it didn't work anymore. So we'll make sure that that solution iteration is there so that we have the highest confidence at the end of the pipeline that we actually get stuff that people are waiting for and that it's ready to be used as well.
And yes, it's a very good point. We at Starburst play the bridge between the startups ecosystem and these governments organizations, and it's not a surprise that when the Innovation Defense Lab, the French Innovation Defense Lab, decided to be more open, they used our locations, 2 floors in our building, to set up their desk and start engaging with startups. It was much easier for them to move 20 people, come with us and have access to a constant flow of startups than to stay in the Paris 15 in their block house. Same thing with the Space Force in Los Angeles. There's their base, but when it comes to engaging with startups, they come to our workspace, they talk to them, we organize private pitch. We organized for the US Air Force the biggest, what they call Space Speech Day, was in San Francisco. 800 military people attended, 60 startup pitch. Elon Musk came, the Secretary of the Air Force came, and they used that event, this pitching competition, and they sign checks worth $50 million to 30 startups. And we even organized 2 years ago, still for the Air Force and the UK Ministry of Defense, the first Allied Defense Accelerator in London around space to bring international startups to the UK, but ultimately to the US. So using also a player like us as who is connected to the local ecosystem, who knows how to translate the startup, pitching and vocabulary with the more structured government organizations, whether it's the French, the US, the German, or the Israeli.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting answers and unexpected as well. I wasn't expecting you to say we were going to take the military to the startups. So, but I do know how much the young people complain when they have to give up their mobile phone coming into the bases. So, are there any questions in the audience? I can see the coffee droopy eyes coming on, and it's not because you are fantastic. Thank you.
Hi, great talk, and I'm Kristen Baldwin from the U.S. Air Force and supporting Space Force as well. My question is, how do we think about preventing, once we've started and maybe created not just the unicorns, but the other companies, to get their feet off the ground and get them some capital and get going? How do we preserve those companies from being invested in further and taken over by competitor nations such as China, who have the same objectives as we do and are happy to use our venture capital to create startups that they then invest in?
To start answering, and then I will let you. I think the US has done a great job on the policy side to put in place CFIUS and other mechanisms to really do a really hard job on that topic. It's completely different in Europe, and that's a big issue. The European policy, whether it's at the European level or the country level, they need to be much more cautious and pay much more attention on all the foreign investment, especially from these countries, in order to prevent them to stall all these technologies and all these investments. And right now, I would say in Europe, we still have a funding issue for these deep tech startups. There's a lack of late-stage investment that is, opening a gap for these outside investors, and that's still an issue. The European Commission is trying to work out on that for space technology, quantum, and others, but I'm not sure it's enough. So that's a great point.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's a great question, and in my previous job as national security advisor, I often got a phone call, mostly from the US side, warning me about some kind of new startup or scale-up that was going bankrupt and was on the verge of being bought by Chinese investors. And I think it begins with providing an alternative. A lot of these companies that are working in the dual-use space, they find great difficulties in connecting to either the established primes or to connect to the government agencies and actually get some meaningful help. We don't have the programs for that. We provide them with grants, mostly from our Ministries of Economic Affairs, and then once they're on the right track, then we stop. And that's the death valley that was talked about earlier. Then, especially in the dual-use realm, there's not enough risk capital around to then actually make that investment, other than Chinese capital. So fill the space, educate them as well. That is part of Diana also. It's to protect, not only to foster. So educate them in how to guard their IP, how to become security aware, what kind of investors should you want in your company and what kind of investors don't you want. So we'll also set up a trusted capital marketplace where we actually connect trusted venture capital with the startups that we've identified as being credible and that are working with Diana. It's a whole range, but I think mostly all of those startups I talked with that we've tried to prevent from being taken over by Chinese capital, they've always told me it's one, impossible to reach you, and two, there are no alternatives to Chinese money. So we need to fix that.
And then if I come back to Starburst, we started to build an accelerator, then an incubator, then some seed funding. In Europe, with Sandra in the room, we are building a bigger fund, 300 millions, but we are also working with other players to raise billions funds, because having the entire life cycle funding mechanism for these startups is really key to maintain our sovereignty.
Thank you. I think there's another question here.
Thank you. Giovanni Samberini, I'm the Deputy Director of the CMRE in La Spezia. Thank you both. Compelling talks and many ideas that we need to explore later. Just riding on your question and most important, your answer, I've had a few talks with a few companies that actually share with me the sorrow of what you just said. Sometimes they get bought simply because there's no other way out. Not because they want, not because they want to expand, not because any other reason, but because they don't know where to ring the bell, to actually provide value to Ministry of Defense. And most of them are genuinely engaged in providing knowledge and technology to the alliance and the nation. So that's an extremely good point. But along those lines, to both of you, Diana has that scheme of phase 1, phase 2, and so on. Some of the good ideas might naturally die out due to the lack of volume of innovation fund, or simply because we need to prioritize. So some of them will have to be parked, put on the back burner, or whatever. You envision the possibility, maybe not for the initial operational capability of Diana, but at least for the final, to create a pool, a basin, a set of these really good innovation ideas, really good innovators that are part of a trusted capital database, but we cannot mature them through the innovation fund, so to pass them on to whoever could. So some kind of engagement after you have discovered the little gems, even if we cannot put them in a crown, at least pass them on to somebody else who can keep them in like the outer rings of the crown. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like the idea, so no, I wouldn't exclude something like that. We do have to be strict, and because otherwise we don't deliver the quality or the sustainability of the companies that we're putting through the accelerator program. So, and I've heard this about other programs that have been set up by governments or by international institutions, that if you become the last resource of money for startups, then you're not doing it right. And some of these programs with large funds, I say to the people that ask, is 1 billion enough? Well, you can make it as big as you want. It doesn't make for better investments. And if you get the name that you are the last resort for funding, then we're not getting the right things out of there. So we need to be strict in setting the problems. We're only looking for things that are solving the problems that we're setting. We're not a showroom for all the best ideas in the world. Second, then to downsize already after 6 months into what are out of these 20 startups that we selected, what are the 5 best that we really believe in. Then foster them, and then we need to put our money where our mouth is and then make sure that we expose them to industry, that we provide that initial funding, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a fine balance.
Yeah, and to add on what you just said is, the key principle of startups that is that 9 out of 10 will die no matter what. So it's part of the Darwinian process to down select, and to make only the strongest succeed. And then there's 2 approach. The pure VC will mostly look at the founders. Do they have great people leading the team, almost regardless of the technology? It's a little bit of caricatural, but it's almost, we want to make sure that the market is big enough. The technology can be swapped many times. And so we look at the founders. Usually when corporates are looking at venture or governments, I'm not saying that they care less about the founders, but they are much more interesting by the technology. So the pure financial people have different interests than the more governmental or corporate organization, and that's going to have to match some way. And that's why third parties, VCs, incubators, and accelerators are a great catch, because it's often a way to cross ideas and make the best decision. Because otherwise you will pick great technologies, but because of the funders, as soon as we'll be out of the incubator or the accelerator, it will die no matter what. So having these 2 aspects in mind is really key for the success of Diana, for the success of these startups, and for the success of our countries.
Just a question. Considering the gap that we've talked about, a death valley between the funding and the timeline, that's one aspect. Another aspect that I think impacts the ability to incorporate innovation or new technology is a fairly long list of NATO STANAGs, MIL standards, DEF stands. Are you seeing also discussions about how we address the gap between new innovative technologies versus very large, long lists of military standards that we've had to live with for many, many years?
I was hoping you would go first here, François. An anecdote from my stepfather, who worked at Epson and at one point was asked for the UK Army to provide mil-spec printers. They were regular matrix printers, but they needed to be able to withstand Gale Force 12 and being held underwater and nuclear blasts. So it took them a while to produce this prototype, and then it went into testing with the Army. And after 15 months, they came back and they said, great, we'll have 2,000 of those. And he was like, well, we don't sell that model anymore. But I can give you the new model, and we can do the same to it, and you can buy that. No, it needs to be tested. So just to say that, yes, we do have an issue there. And with fast cycle innovation, we need to be agile also in setting the standards. Part of being able to do that is to understand technologies as they emerge. And I think our EDT strategy is based with that to mind as well. How do we become the people that are knowledgeable about the implications of AI, so that we can set the standards before the technology has even matured to the stage of being brought into use. We've done that now for AI, and we were late to the game, of course, but you have to start somewhere. We've done it now for data exploitation, where we were also late in the game, but we're catching up. I think we're still in time for autonomy and for quantum, which are the 2 next ones that we're tackling. So when you're ahead of the game, then it's easier to provide guidance to the innovators as to what the standards are that they need to design their products to. And it becomes a much more natural flow than what we have now often, is that people come in and then in hindsight need to work with outdated standards list. But work to be done. I wouldn't say we're there yet.
And just as an anecdote, one of my first job was to work for the US Air Force at the Rome Lab, upstate New York, and work on the MIL handbook. I think it was the 883 on the reliability of electronics. And the task was set because after the first war in Iraq, they were lacking of military GPS, and so they bought a bunch of commercial GPS for the soldiers on the ground, and they realized that they were working as fine for 10 times less the price. And so they were starting to revisit their standards for electronics for the military equipment. I think military standards have always been a constraint. And that's why here we are talking about the dual-use technology. How can we use either electronics, AI, software, or whatsoever that is coming and that has been developed for the commercials, and see if we need a lot of adaptation to be used for the military. But let's try to use it that way and then update the standards or make exceptions. And we will save money, improve. Yeah. And we see that in Ukraine, the communication is coming from a private company without any norm, without any standards. They got jammed at the beginning, but it took them a couple of days to update the software of the satellites and then not be jammed anymore. So we need that reactivity, and the commercial and private sector will bring that to the military.
A very short addition to that,
Very
of a
short.
good example, is our counter-UAS program, where we brought together companies for a week-long exercise with all kinds of different systems, drones, catching drones, nets, you name it. And we asked them to interact and to see how they could integrate their systems and what would be the ideal standard for communication in that. And actually it was the innovators themselves, after a week, that came up with a standard that will now become the NATO standard. So it doesn't always have to come from us, it can come from the innovators as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your contributions, and we're at coffee.
Yes, so please join me in thanking our guest speakers.